Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're going to tackle something I think a lot of folks find kind of, well, intimidating: California's workers' compensation system.
Oh, yeah, it can definitely seem like a bit of a maze, that's for sure.
Right. But we've got this chapter here, and I gotta say, it's way more interesting than I expected. Not just the legal stuff, but the whole history behind it. Like, how do we even get to this system?
That's what I find fascinating, too. It's like a story, you know, a story of compromise and how we try to balance the needs of workers and employers when someone gets hurt on the job.
Okay, so let's go back in time. Before workers' comp existed, what happened if you got injured at work?
Well, picture this. You're a worker back in, say, the 1800s. You get injured, maybe lose a hand, operating some dangerous machine.
Oof. Yeah, not a good scenario.
No, not at all. And your only option back then was to sue your employer?
Sue them, like take them to court.
Yep, exactly. But think about it. You're one person, probably not wealthy, going up against a company with lawyers and resources.
Talk about an uphill battle.
It was. And even if you could afford a lawyer, you had to prove your employer was negligent. Like they did something wrong that caused your injury.
Which, from what I've read, was really hard to do. Employers had all these defenses they could use.
Oh, absolutely. They could say you were careless, that you knew the risks, or blame it on a coworker. The odds were stacked against the worker.
So basically, a lot of injured workers just ended up with nothing.
Sadly. Yeah, many did. It was a system that left a lot of people in really tough situations.
Then comes a moment that I think really changed things: the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911.
A tragedy that's still hard to even comprehend. Over 140 workers, mostly young women, trapped in a burning building.
That fire really shook the nation, and it happened right here in New York City.
It did, and it spurred a wave of reform across the country. Just 17 days later, California took action.
Wow, that's fast.
People were demanding change. Lawmakers realized something had to be done to protect workers and create a safety net. That's where workers' comp comes in.
So, out of this horrible tragedy, this new system is born. But you mentioned something earlier about compromise.
Right. At the heart of workers' comp is this idea of a historic compromise. Both sides, workers and employers, had to give something up to create a system that worked.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did workers have to give up?
They had to give up the potential for those big payouts you might get from a lawsuit.
I imagine some people weren't happy about that.
It was a trade-off. In exchange, employers agreed to accept responsibility for workplace injuries, regardless of who was at fault.
Ah, so that's where the no-fault rule comes in.
Exactly. No more drawn-out court battles trying to prove negligence. It meant faster, guaranteed benefits for injured workers.
And I guess for employers, it meant less legal uncertainty and more predictable costs.
Exactly. The idea was to create a system that was more efficient and provided a safety net for everyone involved.
Sounds pretty straightforward so far. But I'm sensing there's more to the story, right?
Oh, there are definitely nuances. The no-fault rule has some exceptions. For example, if you get hurt doing something reckless at work, your benefits could be reduced.
So there's still some accountability built in.
Absolutely. And on the flip side, if your employer was seriously negligent, like knowingly exposed you to a hazardous environment, your benefits could actually be increased.
So it's not just black and white. The system takes the circumstances into account.
Right. It's about striking a balance. But I gotta say, proving those exceptions, it's not easy.
Yeah, I bet those cases aren't very common then.
You're right. But they show that the system isn't perfect, and there's always room for debate and interpretation.
Now, I'm guessing California's workers' comp system hasn't just stayed frozen in time since it was first created, right? The workplace has changed so much over the years.
It's definitely evolved. There have been tons of updates and reforms over the decades to keep it relevant and address new challenges.
So what are some of the biggest changes that have shaped the system we have today?
Well, starting in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a lot of concern about rising costs.
Makes sense. Healthcare costs in general were going up during that time.
Right. So the reforms back then focused on controlling costs. They introduced new rules for medical evaluations and tried to crack down on fraud.
So kind of like a system tune-up to make sure everything was running smoothly.
Yeah, and to make sure benefits were going to those who truly needed them. But any change to the system, it's going to have ripple effects. There were debates about whether those reforms went too far in limiting benefits.
It's tough, right? Trying to balance costs with ensuring people get the care they need.
It is. And then the early 2000s brought another wave of change. This time it was all about managed care.
Managed care. Now that's a phrase that can make people nervous.
It definitely brought big changes to the workers' comp world. California started using medical provider networks, so injured workers had to choose doctors from within those networks.
So less freedom to choose your own doctor. I bet that was controversial.
It was a mixed bag. On one hand, it helped streamline things and control costs. But on the other, it limited choice and raised concerns about conflicts of interest.
And wasn't there something about utilization review, too? That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, utilization review became a big part of the system. Basically, insurance companies got to review and approve the treatments doctors were recommending.
I can see how that could be helpful in preventing unnecessary treatments.
Right, it's about making sure the care is medically necessary and appropriate. But, anytime you add another layer of bureaucracy, it creates potential for more delays and disputes.
So not a perfect solution, but an attempt to address some real challenges.
Exactly. And the evolution continued. Fast forward to 2013, and we see another round of reforms. This time, the focus shifted towards making the system fairer for workers, especially those with permanent disabilities.
That sounds like a good thing. What changed specifically?
Well, one big change was an increase in permanent disability payments. Before the reform, the amount someone received, it wasn't always enough to cover their lost earnings.
So they tried to make sure people who suffered long-term impacts from their injuries were better compensated.
Exactly. They also simplified the system for determining the level of disability so it'd be easier for workers to understand. Plus, they introduced new ways to resolve disputes, hopefully making things less adversarial.
It's fascinating to see how the system has adapted over time, like it's a living thing almost.
It is always changing and evolving, and that's why it's so important to stay informed whether you're an employer or an employee. What works today might not work tomorrow.
Okay, so we've got this historical backdrop. We've seen how the system has changed over time. But let's bring it back to our listener. Why should they care about all of this? What's the takeaway for them?
Well, whether you work in an office, a factory, or even from home, this system affects you. Understanding it, knowing your rights and responsibilities, that's empowering. It can save you headaches down the line.
I think that's a great point. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to something as important as workers' comp. But I'm ready to dive deeper now. Let's go beyond the history and get into the nuts and bolts of how this system actually works in practice. What triggers workers' comp coverage? It's not like every little sniffle or paper cut at work qualifies.
You're right, not every little thing counts. The key is there has to be a direct connection between your work and the injury or illness. The legal term they use is arising out of and in the course of employment.
Okay, so let's say I trip over a stray stapler at work and break my wrist. That's probably covered. But if I decide to go for a jog during my lunch break and pull a hamstring, that's a different story.
Exactly. The incident has to be tied to your work duties or the environment where you work. It can't be something completely unrelated.
But it's not just physical injuries, right? Our source mentions occupational diseases, too.
Absolutely. Think about a construction worker who develops hearing loss after years of exposure to loud noises, or an office worker who develops carpal tunnel syndrome from repetitive typing.
Ah, so those would be considered work-related illnesses.
Exactly. They fall under workers' comp because they're directly linked to the work environment.
Okay, that makes sense. But proving that an illness is caused by your work, that can't be easy, especially if it develops gradually over time.
Yeah, that's one of the trickiest parts of the system. Think about that office worker with carpal tunnel. How do you prove it's from typing and not, say, from a hobby they do outside of work?
That sounds like it could get complicated fast.
It can. It often requires a lot of medical documentation, maybe even expert testimony, to establish that link between the illness and the work environment.
So, if our listener thinks they might have a work-related illness, what's the first step they should take?
The most important thing is to report it to their employer right away. Don't wait. The sooner you report it, the better.
And then I'm guessing the next step is seeing a doctor. But not just any doctor, right? We talked about those medical provider networks earlier.
Right. If your employer is part of a network, you'll have to choose a doctor from within that network.
What if you already have a doctor you trust who's outside the network?
That can get tricky. You can request to see your own doctor, but it's not always guaranteed. There are rules and procedures for those situations.
Sounds like navigating the system can be a bit of a maze. But you mentioned earlier that the 2013 reforms made some improvements, right?
They did. One of the things they introduced was a process called independent medical review.
Okay, break that down for me. What is that?
So let's say you and the insurance company disagree about the treatment you need. With independent medical review, you can get an unbiased expert opinion to help resolve the dispute.
Ah, so it's like a neutral third party coming in to make a decision.
Exactly. It's designed to make sure you're getting the appropriate medical care, even if there's a disagreement.
It sounds like California is constantly trying to tweak this system to make it more fair and efficient.
It's a work in progress, that's for sure. But the goal is to have a system that protects workers while also providing a clear framework for employers.
A system built on that idea of compromise we talked about earlier, everyone giving a little to make it work.
Exactly. And that balance is always evolving as the workplace itself changes.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, from the history of workers' comp to the complexities of navigating the system today. But I'm eager to dive even deeper. Let's move on to the specifics of benefits. What can someone actually expect if they get injured on the job?
Let's do it. We'll break down the different types of benefits, how they're calculated, and what you need to know to make sure you're getting what you deserve.
Sounds good to me. Stay tuned, folks. We're just getting started. Okay, so we've explored the history and some of the challenges folks face navigating California's workers' comp system. But let's get to the good stuff, the benefits. What are you actually entitled to if you get hurt at work?
Well, the good news is the system's pretty comprehensive. It covers a lot of ground, like your medical bills, and even helps replace some of your lost wages while you recover.
So walk us through it. What are the main benefits California offers to injured workers?
Well, the first and most important one is medical treatment coverage. This basically means all those reasonable medical expenses you rack up because of your work injury, those are covered.
Okay, so we're talking doctor visits, hospital stays, surgeries, medication, the whole shebang.
Yep, pretty much. If it's considered necessary and related to your injury, workers' comp should cover it.
That's got to be a huge relief, right? Knowing you don't have to shoulder those medical bills on top of everything else.
It is. And it's not just the initial care. It covers ongoing treatment and rehab, too, to help you get back on your feet.
So they're invested in your recovery, not just like patching you up and sending you back to work too soon.
That's the idea. The goal is to help you reach what they call maximum medical improvement, basically getting you as close as possible to how you were before the injury.
Makes sense. But what about the financial hit you take when you can't work? How's workers' comp address that?
That's where temporary disability benefits come in. These payments are meant to replace part of your lost wages while you're healing and can't work.
So not a full paycheck, but something to help keep you afloat, right?
Exactly. It's usually around 2/3 of your average weekly wage.
Oh, wow. That's actually pretty significant. Could make a big difference in being able to pay your bills.
It really can. These temporary disability benefits are super important for folks to stay financially stable while focusing on getting better.
Now, what happens if the injury or illness results in a permanent disability? We mentioned those permanent disability benefits earlier, but can we dig into those a bit more?
Sure. If you end up with a permanent disability that affects your work, you might qualify for these benefits. They're designed to make up for that loss of future earnings.
And you mentioned the 2013 reforms boosted these payments, right? What impact did that have?
Oh, it was huge for folks with lasting impairments. Before that, the old system, well, some folks felt it was a bit stingy, especially for those with more serious disabilities. So the 2013 reform tried to fix that.
Seems like they're always working to make the system more fair.
Yeah, it's a constant process. But even with these reforms, I'll be honest, there can still be challenges and disputes, especially when they try to figure out how much your disability impacts you and how much you should get.
I can imagine that gets complicated. Lots of gray area there.
You got it. They do medical evaluations, assess your abilities, even look at your age, education, work history, all that stuff.
Whoa, that's a lot to consider. Sounds like a recipe for disagreement.
It happens. That's why we have that independent medical review process, remember. If there's a fight over your disability level, that can help sort things out.
Checks and balances, I like it. But let's switch gears a bit and talk about the employer side of things. We focused a lot on worker benefits, but employers have rights in this system too, right?
Absolutely. It's got to be a two-way street, remember. Like we said, workers' comp is all about that historic compromise and finding balance.
So what are some key rights employers have in California's workers' comp system?
Well, one big one is they can choose the treating physician within their medical provider network. California often requires employers to be part of these networks.
So they get a say in who provides that initial medical care for their injured worker. Seems fair.
Right. Plus, if they don't agree with the diagnosis or the treatment plan, they can ask for a second opinion.
That makes sense. They want to make sure the treatment's appropriate for the injury and everything.
Exactly. It's not about doubting the worker, but more about making sure the care is effective and based on, good medical practice.
And while they have to offer benefits no matter who's at fault, they also have the right to investigate claims to make sure they're legit and actually work-related.
Oh, yeah, that's super important. Sadly, there are cases of fraud out there. So employers got to protect themselves and their businesses.
Accountability on both sides then, right?
You got it. Which brings us to another key part, dispute resolution. Like, what if there's a disagreement about the claim, whether it's about the injury itself, the right treatment, or the benefit amount? How do they figure that out?
From what I've gathered, California's system, it doesn't just throw everyone in a courtroom, right? There's a whole process for handling these disputes.
Right. They try to work things out informally first. Open communication is key. But if that doesn't cut it, there are formal procedures. We've already touched on independent medical review for treatment disagreements.
But what about other types of disputes? Like, say, arguing over whether an injury actually happened at work, or if the employer thinks the worker is exaggerating their disability, what then?
Those kinds of disputes usually go to the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board. It's kind of like a mini court, specifically for these cases.
So both sides present their evidence, their arguments, and a judge makes the final call.
Exactly. It's supposed to be fair and impartial. And of course, let's not forget the lawyers.
Oh yeah, them. While you don't always need a lawyer for every claim, they can be super helpful, especially when things get complicated or if there's a dispute.
For sure. They know the ins and outs of the law, the procedures, the whole 9 yards. Having an expert on your side can make a big difference.
It sounds like they really try to balance protecting workers while giving employers a fair shake, too. But here's a question that keeps popping into my head. This system was designed ages ago, right? Like back when most folks worked in factories or traditional offices. How is he keeping up with the way work is changing today?
Now that's the million-dollar question. We're talking remote work, the gig economy, AI, automation, the whole works. All this is changing how and where we work and the risks we face.
So how do you apply a system meant for, like, factory floors to these new ways of working? Seems tricky.
It is. It's a hot topic right now. Like, how do you even decide if someone working from home got hurt in the course of employment? Or how do you classify gig workers? Big questions. Lawmakers and legal experts are wrestling with this stuff right now.
It makes you wonder if the whole system needs a revamp, like a total reboot, to stay relevant in this century.
Some folks say yes, scrap it and start over. Others think the existing framework just needs some, updates and adjustments.
It'll be interesting to see what happens, how California tackles these challenges down the road.
Totally. The future of work and the future of workers' comp, they're definitely intertwined.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The history, the benefits, the challenges, and even peeked into the future a bit. But before we wrap things up, let's circle back to our listener one more time. We've learned a ton about California's workers' comp system, but if someone's listening, wanting to feel protected and informed, what's like the one thing they should take away from all this?
I'd say awareness. Just knowing this system exists and understanding what your rights and responsibilities are, whether you're an employee or an employer, that's a huge first step.
Like having a map before you head out on a trip, right? You might not know every single turn, but you have a general idea where you're going.
Exactly. And remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. There's a ton of resources out there to help folks navigate the system. The California Department of Industrial Relations website, that's a great place to start. Tons of info, guides, even like FAQs.
And don't forget about those workers' comp attorneys we mentioned. If you're ever in doubt or things get complicated, getting legal advice is always a smart move.
Totally agree. Think of it like having a guide who knows the trail. They can help you avoid the pitfalls and make sure you get the support you're entitled to.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm kind of struck by how complex and, alive this system is, shaped by history, economics, legal stuff, even just like societal values.
It's amazing, isn't it? Constantly changing, adapting to new challenges, always trying to find that balance between protecting workers and keeping things fair for employers.
And it makes you realize that even in something as, technical as workers' comp, there are real people's stories involved, stories of resilience and sometimes struggle and figuring out how to move forward after a workplace injury or illness.
And those stories, they remind us why it's so crucial to have a system that provides support, a safety net, and works towards fairness for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We started by jumping into the past, the history of workers' comp, and now I hope our listeners are resurfacing with a much deeper understanding of this system.
And maybe feeling a bit more empowered, too. Knowing more, understanding your options, that gives you confidence to navigate this stuff.
I know. I feel way more informed now. It's been a wild ride.
Me too. It just shows you there's always more to learn, even about things we think we know.
So, to all our deep divers out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep advocating for a system that truly works for both workers and employers.
And until next time, keep diving.
See you in the depths.